it seems to me that pricing of gas or oil is crucial at market rates to give the correct price signals to consumers. Majid, as somebody who's been involved with trying to develop cross-border gas supplies in the region for many years, I'd be interested, I think the audience would be interested in your take on the challenges of building out these types of networks and providing some sort of price transparency, not least because the two landmark cross-border gas supply projects that we've seen in the region, and I'm thinking of the Arab Gas Pipeline and Dolphin, only one of them could be regarded as a long-term success. The second one, the Arab Gas Pipeline, of course, suffers from a lack of gas, which is crucial for any gas pipeline. Give us your thoughts on the status and challenges facing those with trying to build these kinds of networks.
Sure. Well, stepping back to the overall theme of sustainable energy, and as I said yesterday, for me, sustainable means it's got to be not just sustainable in supply and in terms of impact on the environment, but also cost. You've got to have the balance. You can't just have, one blindly followed or the other. And looking at other regions in the world, the stark contrast between, say, Germany and the U.S. In the U.S., thanks to the shale gas revolution, role of the private sector, not only have energy costs come down, but carbon emissions are down to the lowest level in 20 years, the lowest per capita in 50 years. With no Kyoto targets, they actually exceeded any. I know they might back in now and try and make them retroactive. Whereas somewhere like Germany, which is typical of Europe, 160 billion euros of German consumers' money gone into subsidizing renewables, less than 12% capacity utilized, and they're now importing coal from the US, lignite coal even, for power, and have the fastest growing carbon emissions. So first thing I want to do is dispel this apparent dichotomy between clean energy and affordable energy. What we actually need is good, comprehensive energy policy, as the report espouses, which looks at the whole thing holistically. And very few governments, as is pointed out in the report focuses on the Arab world, of course, and says that Dubai is the only government which has a body looking at long-term energy policy. But actually in the whole world, I don't know of governments in Europe or even the United States where there's a comprehensive long-term energy policy. And energy policy needs 20, 30-year planning. And unfortunately, governments, particularly in the West, can't see beyond 1 year sometimes. So there is this challenge. Looking back to the region, and gas in particular, I'm a firm believer in gas. Of course, the importance of oil has been covered by Sam very well, but this region has currently 40% officially of the world's proven gas reserves. But most of that was discovered looking for oil. There's been very little and only very recent exploration for gas, so I think that number could be much, much higher. And yet the irony is every country in the region is short of gas. Even Iran, which has the highest reserves in the world, according to BP's latest report, even higher than Russia, is a net importer of gas. So something's clearly wrong, as you said, with the pricing signals. On the demand side, this is the fastest growing market for gas in the Middle East now. Now, we definitely do need to tackle the subsidies. It's not an easy issue. It's even harder when you have Arab Spring turmoil and elections, and it's very hard to take these decisions, or these plans sometimes take many years to implement, and you need to soften it for the most needy. But as was pointed out yesterday, leaving it open-ended actually subsidizes the wealthy disproportionately more, and the high consumers more than the needy. On the supply side, we do need much better fiscal terms in the upstream, and recognition that gas investments are different from oil, and higher capital expenditure, transportation and processing infrastructure. But obviously the market also, and that means electricity market primarily, and price to industry, needs to reflect the cost of discovery of the gas. By and large, the national oil companies haven't developed gas as much. They focused on developing the oil. They haven't done as much exploration or downstream either. So the role of the private sector, I think, is very important. Just looking at some of the projected investment requirements by Apicorp, they're in the trillions of dollars over the next 20, 25 years. And with the huge social and other spending required by the governments, there needs to be the private sector. And it's not just about money, it's really about the management skills and the project execution. These are large, complex projects. They have links to industry as well as to the power sector. And they're very well, in a way, very well suited to enhancing the role of the private sector. And the US example, of course, it's not easily replicable. The way the market is a totally free market in the US is very different from even Europe or the Middle East. But it shows you what can be achieved when you unleash the private sector in a certain area. You see it in the telecom sector in the Middle East or real estate sector, but the energy sector, I think, needs that as well. And it doesn't need to be a threat to governments or to the national oil companies. It can actually be a very good complement.
Sure.
So, as Bassam mentioned, oil has been stable for the last 4 years at $110 a barrel. If we were really seeing the shrinking market and competition, we would see the price indicators. And this region has the lowest cost oil, so if anyone's going to be substituted, it's this new high-cost unconventionals that's coming to the market. I don't see the U.S., I think it's extremely interesting, and I think it means the U.S. is no longer going to be a major market, yes, but it was never where the growth was anyway, as we saw from Bassam's charts. The growth is in the non-OECD. So Chinese demand is actually a much more important factor for this region. But even more important factor is our own demand. Saudi's burning 3 million barrels a day of liquids today. I mean, that's almost as much as India. That is actually the aspect we need to tackle to handle our own, or to manage our own future threat to our future export revenues. It's not U.S. supply, it's our own demand.
But where is the next wave of Arab oil production going to come from? I mean, we look at Iraq. They have consistently failed to meet their production targets for various reasons. Saudi Arabia is taking a pause at the moment. Okay, we have shut-in production in Libya and many of the smaller countries afflicted by unrest like Sudan, Syria, Yemen. But my question is, why are the investment signals not translating, given the low cost of production, into investment?
I totally endorse Bassam's first answer, and that it's insufficient involvement of the private sector and increased resource nationalism. The national oil companies were, created 60s and 70s, in a post-colonial era so that the state gets control of these resources. But back then, Britain had a national oil company. The world has moved on, and it's been seen in other sectors and in other parts of the world, in this sector, the importance of involving the private sector. You mentioned Iraq. The International Energy Agency forecasts 40% of growth in crude production over the next 2 decades is to come from Iraq, and yet so far, it had forecasted 6 million barrels a day by 2012. We're 2013, and it's just dropped below 3 million barrels a day. And again, it's because the mindset that the state needs to manage and control everything, and giving insufficient signals for the right investment. That's actually more important than what you see on the news, the security issues and the bombs and the bureaucracy and the corruption. Those are part of it, but fundamentally it's the wrong policy that's holding that back. And people sometimes talk about supply and demand as if supply is stable. A very important factor is, even if there's no new incremental demand, or it's a couple of % per year, we're having huge decline rates in the major oil fields in the region, which means regardless of flat demand worldwide, we need to be adding almost a new Saudi Arabia every 5 years or so, which is not easy to achieve for world markets. So I do think this region is still going to be very important for world markets going forward. And having said that, we're punching below our weight, and the situation is getting worse. You say they're welfare states, but I mean, Robin mentioned, for example, here in the UAE, they've introduced Sharjah, bands for consumption, so that the first band of consumption is at the lower price, because that's the most, the small home, an average home. And then the more you consume, the more you pay. Countries like Saudi haven't done things like that. And what we have in the region, the opposite of the rest of the world, is the consumer gets subsidized more than industry. Usually in developed economies, industry gets the lower price because you want to encourage economic growth and job creation, and the consumer pays the highest price. Here we have the opposite. And for a definition of subsidy, I would say selling it at below the international market price. That's my definition of subsidy, because that's the opportunity cost to the government, assuming it's in sufficient quantities to export. So, in Saudi you have burning crude oil for power at $110 a barrel, and then supplying gas to petrochemicals at $4 a barrel. Aside from the damage to the turbines and the pollution that causes. In the region we have importing of LNG, very, very expensive, from the other side of the world. And Qatar is there with huge resources in the middle, but due to political issues, it can't achieve exports to all, even its immediate neighbors.
I wish there was a simple way to define subsidies, as Majid.
No, I said that's my definition. I'm coming from the industry.
Point of view,
I'm coming from the industry. I'm not reading World Bank reports.